Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm teacher Ahmad Jamul. I'm glad to talk about chapter 15, regulation of the female sexual hormones, and start talking about document 1, the sexual cycle. Back in chapter 1, you studied about the female reproductive system. You learned about the events that follow ovulation in a female. You now know that if ovulation is followed by fertilization, the embryo formed is implanted in the uterus where it develops for 9 months. Whereas if ovulation is not followed by fertilization, menses occurs, which refers to the blood discharged from the uterus of the female. In this document, you will learn about the structure of the uterus and what modifications occur to this female organ to allow the embryo implantation. You will also learn about other modifications that occur in a female body during her sexual cycle. Let's start with the anatomy of the female uterus. It has both the shape and the size of an upside-down pear. It is formed of an upper wide part, the body, and a lower narrow part, the cervix. Document A of your books shows a longitudinal section of the uterus. The body is formed of serous external layer. A muscular layer called the myometrium plays an important role in pregnancy because it is elastic and during delivery because it contracts. The internal layer called endometrium, which is richly vascularized and thus ensures nutrition for the embryo in case of pregnancy. Those three layers make the uterine wall that surrounds an empty chamber known as the uterine cavity. The cervix in turn is formed of cervical mucosa with glands secreting mucus. It connects to the uterus through the internal aperture and ends with an external aperture towards the vagina. On the next slide, we will focus on the histological structure of the uterus to understand the phenomena of bleeding at the level of the endometrium. Document B of your books gives a closer look at the uterine wall. In this document, you can see that the endometrium, which is the innermost layer of the uterine wall, is in turn made up of two layers. The basal layer that contains the undifferentiated stem cells capable of cell division, and the functional layer or the superficial layer that is highly vascularized and contains endometrial glands that secrete substances needed for the implantation and later development of the embryo. But the uterine wall of a female doesn't always look the same if observed at different days of her cycle. Document C of your books shows the cross-section of a female's uterus at different instants. The first figure, during menses, shows how the superficial layer of the endometrium is sloughing off and the basal layer is nearly exposed, while few days after menses, the superficial layer of the endometrium grows again as shown in the second figure. And finally, few days before the second menses, this superficial layer becomes even thicker with a different shape as well. It seems that the uterine wall undergoes some modifications throughout the female cycle. Those modifications are repeated again each month. We say they are cyclic. The cyclic changes in the superficial layer of the endometrium are referred to as endometrial cycle. Document D of your books shows this endometrial cycle and the different phases of this cycle. During menses, the superficial layer of the endometrium degenerates. The sloughing off of this superficial layer exposes the blood vessels beneath and causes bleeding that continues for an average of 5 days. Then after menses, the endometrium begins to thicken again due to the proliferation of the basal layer cells. That's why this phase of the endometrium is referred to as the proliferative phase. During the proliferation phase, uterine glands begin to enlarge and the endometrium becomes richly supplied with blood vessels. 14 days before the next menses, the thickening of the endometrium is accelerated. It becomes really thick and the uterine glands start secreting liquid rich in nutrients for any potential embryo implantation. That's why this phase is referred to as the secretory phase. During this phase, the endometrium looks like lace. That's why we call it uterine lace. Finally, all this superficial layer that has been developing during both proliferative and secretory phases will slough off again if no embryo implantation occurs. This menses indicates the beginning of a new endometrial cycle of an average duration of 28 days. But the uterus is not the only organ that experiences cyclic modifications. In Chapter 1, you have previously seen the cyclic events that occur in the ovary as well every single month. Document D shows how the endometrial and ovarian cycles are synchronized. While menses and proliferation occur in the uterus, the follicle in the ovary will develop, and one of them will be ready for ovulation. This phase of the ovarian cycle is referred to as the follicular phase or pre-ovulatory phase. Now, after ovulation, the ruptured follicle persists in the ovary and turns into a corpus luteum, which takes 14 days to degenerate in the absence of fertilization. This phase of the ovarian cycle, which is referred to as the luteal phase or post-ovulatory phase, occurs parallel to the secretory phase of the endometrial or uterine cycle, which will end up after 14 days after ovulation if no fertilization occurs and will be followed by a new menses. The cyclic modifications in the female's body don't only include the ovary and the uterus. The cervix and the vagina also show some cyclic changes during the female cycle. The lining of the cervix, which is the narrow part of the uterus, secretes mucus throughout the female cycle. The secreted mucus, however, doesn't always seem to be the same. Around ovulation, this mucus is watery and loose to allow the passage of sperms, while in other days of the cycle, the secreted mucus becomes thick and viscous, which prevents the passage of sperms. That's why the type of cervical mucus indicates the fertile period of a female. On the other hand, and just like the uterine wall, the vaginal wall is also made up of layers. The inner layer is made up of basal stem cells and differentiated functional cells. If a vaginal smear is observed under the microscope after being stained, the basal cells will appear in green and the differentiated cells will appear in pink. Document F of your books shows the vaginal smears taken at different days of the female cycle. You can obviously see the changes that occur in the vaginal wall throughout the cycle, where the number of differentiated cells increases by 2 folds around the day of ovulation. Those cells are responsible for the secretions needed to facilitate the sexual intercourse around ovulation. Another modification during the female cycle is related to her body temperature. Document E of your books shows the variation in the body temperature of a female throughout the cycle. Notice that temperature fluctuates between 36.7 and 37 degrees Celsius during menses and proliferative phase. However, an increase in the body temperature occurs at ovulation to reach 37.2 and fluctuates around this value till the end of the cycle. To sum up, in this document you have learned about the modifications that a female experiences throughout her cycle. These modifications include the ovary, the superficial layer of the uterine wall, the cervical mucus, the superficial layer of the vaginal wall, and the body temperature. All modifications listed above occur in a cyclic manner. That means they are repeated every month. Although these modifications occur in different organs, but they are parallel to each other, we say these modifications are synchronized. Have you ever heard of the word synchronicity? By definition, it is when events that seem to be unrelated occur together in a parallel way. But does synchronicity of events in the female body occur only by coincidence, or does this synchronicity indicate an underlying regulation? This is what you will find out in the next document.